Welcome to the ASEAN Wonk podcast, where we bring you expert insights and regional perspectives on Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific geopolitics and geoeconomics. I'm your host, Dr. Prashant Paramaswaran, and if you haven't already, do subscribe to the ASEAN Wonk platform at www.aseanwonk.com. Our guest today is Brigadier General David Stilwell, who served as Assistant Secretary of State under the first Trump administration, after a series of other roles as well, including at the Pentagon as Defense Attaché to China and as part of the U.S. Air Force, where he started his career back in 1980. We'll start our conversation talking through a number of contemporary developments, including the Trump administration's approach to Southeast Asia and country perspectives on not being forced to choose between China and the United States. Be sure to stay tuned as we go through a range of other subjects, including the future trajectory of U.S.-China relations and Washington's approach to flashpoints such as Taiwan and the South China Sea. So welcome to the podcast, General Stilwell. I wanted to start, given your experience serving in the first Trump administration, with where you sort of see continuities and changes in Trump 1 versus Trump 2. Talking to policymakers in the region, there's a sense that in the second Trump administration, we're seeing the obvious headline makers like the hardening of tariff policy, some continuity on issues like scam centers, for example. And there's also a category of maybe a little bit too early to say definitively on where we're heading on issues like China policy as we build up to leader interactions there. You travel extensively in the region, and we've actually been at a few engagements as well over the past year in Southeast Asia. What's your sense of how things are looking on the Asia policy front in Washington, as well as the regional perceptions and responses to that?
Well, thanks for having me here, and hopefully my perspective adds to the conversation and doesn't detract too much. But the focus has been on great powers, big economies, India, China, and then from there Northeast Asia, primarily Japan. We can talk about that later. The over under on that. So Southeast Asia in general, I think, has gotten a pretty good treatment on this. The agreement with Vietnam came across fairly quietly, without a lot of drama, which says there's interest in shifting markets and development and production centers away from one main aggressive and adversarial center and shifting it to countries that have lower labor costs, have many other advantages that the PRC has since lost. So I can't speak to all, but I do know that I was fairly happy with how the agreement with Vietnam came about. And we're going to focus primarily on economic sense, unlike Trump 1, where the focus, the action areas where the Defense Department and the State Department, it really seems like there's been a shift away from that more toward the Commerce, Treasury, and USTR. No criticism there. It's, if you're looking at national debt now at $37.5 trillion, you got to do something to get that under control. And if you do that by pumping up the economy, moving industry back to the U.S., all the things that we're hearing about, that's a reasonable approach. I would just say it can't come at the cost of those other traditional security centers like defense and the state.
Got it. And I agree with your point there on, it really depends on which countries you're looking at. I do think that certain countries, maybe think that they've gotten a good start relative to where the second Trump administration has been compared to the first administration, and others maybe not as much. And so that's a very important perspective to sort of look at this not as the aggregate, but looking at it as well in terms of individual countries and partnerships. The other aspect that I think is a really interesting conversation is one thing I wanted to zoom in a bit on, which is what we've been hearing since actually a few years ago publicly from Southeast Asian officials about not being forced to choose between the United States and China. My own sense has long been that this is more about the choices that these countries actually make for themselves and how they make them, rather than anything that's imposed by Washington or other countries. And sometimes, as we both know, choices are being made more for shorter term regime interests, which are not necessarily the same as longer term national interests. You spent a lot of time thinking through the issue of choices. I recall when you were assistant secretary, you tried to emphasize the fact that under the first Trump administration, just because there was a greater focus on sovereignty didn't mean that there wasn't room for pluralism and notions of multipolarity. At the same time, you fast forward a few years to the present. Just a few weeks ago, we saw China with its Shanghai Cooperation Organization summitry in Tianjin promote more aggressively its own notion of what a world order should look like. The sort of global governance initiative was rolled out. How much room do you think there is for this kind of pluralism and coexistence of worldviews as these views are competing increasingly between the United States and China, and other capitals are sort of adjusting their own approaches to this as well?
I love the idea of pluralism. We took some heat over that presentation at Brookings when we gave it in 2019. The mighty David Feith wrote that speech. He wrote it at the last minute because what he just had this change of heart. He goes, no, I really want to talk about this. And the folks at Brookings were a little surprised that we went down that path. But think about it. That was my experience everywhere I went, is people were very happy when an American diplomat did not show up with a non-pluralistic agenda saying, my way or the highway, you're going to go human rights, you're going to do all these things that we demand of you without. I grew up as a fighter pilot, and we're a fairly direct bunch. We don't use a lot of diplomatic language. And one of the first things you learn is you've got two ears and one mouth, and you should use them in those proportions. Well, I suggest that our diplomats should consider that, because I oftentimes would follow one of my colleagues into a capital, and they had just gotten wire brushed and the finger wagged in their face about doing things that were culturally the norm for them. So, one, we have to stop preaching at folks. We need to listen to what they have to say. If we want to guide them, if we want to see change in how things are going, if there's human rights practices, we gently guide them into that without trying to force them. And so it starts off with diplomacy. And again, State Department, we should be teaching these things as we raise our diplomats. On that point, though, the Chinese version of this stuff is unipolar. It's unilateral. It's my way or the highway. You will do these things. And then they go after these countries at the SCO summit. I mean, it's rogues gallery. It's countries that really have no accountability with their own populations. And my first experience with this was at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2014. I went with the chairman of the Joint Staff, Marty Dempsey, and Chuck Hagel, a Republican congressman who the Obama administration brought in as Secretary of Defense. What a great choice. And Abe, no, who was it, 14? I think it was Abe. No, he wasn't. He wasn't there. I think it was Motegi. Anyway, the Japanese made a very strong press for watching out for what the PRC is doing with debt traps and all that stuff. It was the first time there was actually a really strong contentious back and forth between the PRC and, in this case, the U.S. All the others was kind of hanging back behind the U.S., going, okay, you guys take this one, but we don't want to get splashed. Don't make us choose between the two of you. And that's why this headline really got my attention, is we want a strong economic relationship with the PRC, but we want the U.S. to provide our security. Now, think about the math on that. When you're doing trade and general, economic interaction and those things, it should be a win-win. Everybody's condition increases. Security is not that way. Security is a bill. It's costly. We're going to spend $850 billion this year on the Defense Department, and that's not even enough. So I've been wrestling with that since 2014. I hadn't come up with a good 4-syllable response. Don't make us choose. A very good friend and a former colleague and a former boss came back with Lee Hsien Loong chose. I like that one, but maybe a little more, be something a little less. So if any of your listeners,
Lee Kuan Yew, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah. And Lee Hsien Loong, one of the reasons with this headline was trying his best to hedge. He did not like that choice. Thank you for that. I'll point to Pakistan. Pakistan went all in with the PRC, with this China-Pakistan economic corridor, and now they're regretting it. And they want to get out of this bad deal. Well, if I was in charge, I would say, I'm not going to make you choose. You decide which way you want to go, but it's a one-way door. Because if you're going to trade on American interests and American taxpayer dollars and use that to sweeten the deal with the PRC, well, don't come running back to us when that deal goes south, as the China-Pakistan economic corridor is. And the last thing on that, if we want to talk about finance, it's obscene that the Islamabad has gotten so badly in debt on this China-Pakistan economic thing that provides them no benefit. This thing is about moving energy from Gwadar port into Kashgar in Western China, and the Pakistani government gains very little or anything from that, but yet they're stuck with the bill. And so in order to keep them from defaulting, they're going to the IMF. The IMF has taken American, large part contributions, and they're not going to Islamabad. Where's that money going? It's going to Beijing. So they're actually validating this debt trap diplomacy, and we're a part of it. I don't want to I don't want to be involved in that in any way. Pakistan, you made your deal with the devil. You're going to go live with it. You figure out how to get out of this. Default. That would be a good choice. Default. And then from there, we can work with you. But don't take good money from World Bank and IMF and send it off to Beijing for your bad decisions.
Right. And I just wonder, just to follow up quickly on that, in terms of the choices that these countries make or want to make, is there a sense of that there are certain areas where those choices are more important, where these things are a little bit more black and white? I don't want to say black and white, but it's pretty clear the choice that these countries are making. So I'm just thinking telecommunications is a very different space from, say, retail. Where you choose to get your submarines from, for example, that's a very different capability from, say, buying rifles, right? For example, because one is much more sticky and there are big concerns about interoperability. The other one, not as much. So I'm wondering, in your experience, is there a way to think about these choices in ways that are much more granular in terms of what these countries are facing?
In an ideal world, we would all go back and read about the Cold War and note that early on we did try our best to make a deal with the Soviet devil. And eventually, what was the answer to that? It was called containment. And so we had the Soviet bloc and you had the free world. And look, as much as we hate to go back to this, as much as people don't want to think about the Cold War and nuclear annihilation and worse, we just went through a pandemic. This is clearly part of the calculus. It's an ugly truth that we're all going to have to sit down and eventually come up with a plan to decouple and get out of this mess. Now, you have a great question about, you buy submarines or you buy submarine cables. Is one better than the other? Let me offer a contrast. We intervene in several submarine cable purchases or contracts with Huawei before they made a decision, using a number of instruments. One called the Transaction Assistance Fund, which doesn't get as much play as it should. You remember this one? It was a $10 million budget point, and it used the thing that America has the most of, our surplus. We're burgeoning in one thing, and that's lawyers. And so we took this surplus of lawyers, like Xi Jinping took with One Belt, One Road and steel. And we go, what do we do with all this stuff? Well, how about we ship it overseas and help Burma make a decision on whether this Chakpu port is legal, if it's sustainable, all those things. And we helped them negotiate down a big bill for this port and energy facility down to something that was a lot more reasonable. So not all these deals that we make, if we can turn them into something that looks more like a reasonable non-debt trap arrangement, well, send our lawyers there. I think the TAF is still active. I think we should use it a lot more. But where submarine cables and other things, these strategic concepts, in a world where it's not about nuclear or kinetic warfare, we are in the world of economic and information warfare. And I plan to talk a lot about that here. And then outsourcing your submarine cable development to Huawei and others might not be your best choice. On the other hand, the concept, the prospect of a Vietnamese Kilo submarine engaging with a Chinese gray hull combatant and possibly winning that exchange, I love that idea. Vietnam has its own sovereignty issues. It has its own long geographical frictions with the PRC, 9-line, 11-line. And it has come to a head. In 1988, there's a video of PLA Navy folks machine gunning a bunch of Vietnamese sailors standing in needy water in a parasail. So it's not. It's definitely there's a lot of friction there. If they happen to use Russian stuff, which is pretty good to defend themselves, I love the idea of Beijing staring at Moscow and going, "Did you really have to sell these guys your subs? India's bought that stuff and others." So let's use a little bit of judo here. Remember, judo is using your adversary's effort and energy against them. We're no longer Nebraska linemen. We're not 300 pounds, and we can't put the adversary on their butt anymore. We can't just bulldoze people. We're going to have to use our heads and use concepts like judo, where we see the PRC digging a hole and making a mistake. As Napoleon said, never interrupt your adversary in the middle of a mistake, and then maybe even amplify that mistake for them. Let's be a little bit more nuanced in our thinking.
You mentioned something there. It's really interesting, which is the example of the Chakpyu port in Myanmar and the assistance that the U.S. gave, which brings to mind. Often there is a focus sometimes on these kind of bright, shiny infrastructure projects that come online, these new projects, but actually the things that are behind that, the sort of, I don't like the sort of hard-soft distinction, but just for the purposes of the conversation, hard infrastructure, but also the soft infrastructure components to support that, whether it's technical assistance, capacity building, the ability to evaluate projects. As you said, that was very important for Myanmar at that time, to be able to make sure that they weren't making a decision that they would later end up regretting. But that's not something that makes a lot of the headlines, right? And that's another aspect of that I'm interested in your experience on, because you've dealt both with the defense space, but then also you've had a number of positions, including at the State Department, dealing with is the level of appreciation for, we talk a lot about the foreign aid, the infrastructure piece, but private sector and U.S. companies and their involvement in the region. Because that's something which I would argue, actually, the elites have a good understanding of this. I am actually not quite sure that among the broader publics in Southeast Asia, there is that appreciation of how the U.S. investment by the private sector companies is actually quite significant. And, not just that, but also CSR initiatives, labor training programs, education initiatives. But that's something which, often doesn't get compared as a like for like, right? It's, the U.S. doesn't do big infrastructure projects, but that's kind of obfuscates a little bit the asymmetric difference in capabilities. So China might do something in this domain, but the United States might do something very different in the commercial domain.
A giant topic. Let me start off with how this comes to be. In rudimentary, not fully developed governance, or countries with governments that are still more on the authoritarian side, it's really hard to hold your leaders to account. So your hard and soft infrastructure, they make decisions not based on overall betterment of their own people. They make them based on elite capture and money. You look at Solomon Islands and Sotovar and the rest of that stuff. And you see it in Southeast Asia as well. Key to that is transparency. So one thing we can do, we got a lot of reporters do, is we can help them expose and show and hold accountable their leaders. Not to the point, like, unfortunately, USAID had gotten a reputation for doing, as far as kind of funding revolutionary groups because they weren't pro-LGBT or supporting X or pick one. Instead of focusing on the basis of what AID was putting food on the table and helping people thrive, it did drift into more sensitive subjects back to pluralism. We have to accept that these countries are moving at their own pace, and they won't go faster just because we're pumping money in there. And again, the governments look at AID money and many times don't want it because it brings with it all these strings. So it's unfortunate there are some programs that were beneficial that are going to suffer, but I think, in 2 or 3 years, when we then now take stock and look at the ones that were doing good things, PEPFAR and others, vaccines, food, we can sift the chaff and the wheat on that. So other things worth talking about are those deals made in places like Naypyidaw and that Mitsone Dam deal. Now, I don't know how Beijing got the initial approvals going there, started building that dam. But when the government of Myanmar saw what this thing was turning into, they rightfully shut it down. And good on them for having the courage of going that, like Star Wars, it's not the deal I signed up for. And from Beijing, you're prey. I'm changing the deal, prey. I don't change it more. So infrastructure in itself is a unvarnished good. It is helping people move things and people around, and all that. That's a good thing. But when it comes to these extra strings, or the quality without transparency is shoddy, and now we've got governments holding the bill for stuff that's not helping them. I mean, there's a runway. We got of all the places, ASEAN plus one, Timor-Leste. There was a runway built on the south part of Timor-Leste that within maybe a year began to crack and crumble and is of zero use. And yet they are going to have to pay for that, the folks in Timor-Leste. So as far as private sector goes, well, let's look at the bad examples. Let's talk about Goldman Sachs and the 1MDB deal in Malaysia. Goldman Sachs was every bit a part of that. So we've got to police our own, make sure that these deals aren't looking more like a Chinese deal and looking more like what you'd expect coming out of the U.S. But in my travels, a couple things came to light. I got to all but two of the ASEAN countries. I spent more than half my time before the pandemic in ASEAN. And to me, it is the fulcrum. It is the point that we need to focus on in the Indo-Pacific. That is going to, one, be highest bang for the buck. We can get the most out of investment in this relationship, and also needs our attention because of the, disparate nature of the 10 member states. Things we can do to maybe help themselves. I'll talk about those in a bit. So we saw 1MDB that was just bad. But then you look at HP. When I was in Singapore, I had my first experience with VR at the HP group there, and it was amazing. You put on these goggles and you go up this. You feel like you're going up an elevator, and the door opens, and there's basically a plank, like you're on a pirate ship and you're walking a plank. And it was really hard to step out of that plank. You're absolutely sure there's tile in front of you, but it plays with your mind. A really interesting capability. HP trains native managers, local managers. Unlike the PRC, which you're seeing in Pakistan right now, they bring in all their own labor. Booze swilling, pork eating atheist Chinese in a Islamic country, it doesn't go well. That's why Islamabad is fronting 15,000 troops to kill Pakistanis in Balochistan who are not happy with the Chinese operating in there. So, strange bedfellows with these Chinese deals. Again, it's not our job to fix it. What American companies do, is they want better insurance. They want to improve the law, not because of some altruistic or they want to give away, because you train these people, they'll actually do a much better job for you. This is a basic American concept. Vietnam, Starbucks offers its employees free four-year college degree, online, virtual, fine, but it's a lot better than the deals they're getting from other places. So last point on this is, as we traveled around, again, a criticism of in some part of what the State Department's been doing, is we are extremely uncomfortable advocating for American companies and American solutions to technical problems in these capitals. And so the Chamber of Commerce and all these American company, or actually global companies in these near the embassy, when we meet with them, they were frustrated because the PRC would roll in with bribes and cash and all stuff, and we would lose these deals over and over again. Whereas if we had just a little bit more support from the Foreign Commercial Services and others at the U.S. embassies, our people out front, we would get our best diplomats in front of our partners. And those diplomats are our businesses. It's our business people. It's gone wrong in the past, American fruit in Central America, I get it. But from my experience in the region, American business put the best face of America forward, and they're everywhere. And 25,000 in the State Department, Foreign Service officers, a lot more business people out there in the world than that.
Yeah, I think you brought up some good points there, particularly on sometimes it's often said the sort of strings that come with U.S. assistance or U.S. funding, but as you pointed out, actually there are strings irrespective of where the source comes from, right? The strings are just different. and the elites or the regimes may interpret those strings differently. Whether it's USAID or a private U.S. company, or it's coming from China, or it's coming from Australia, so on and so forth. And the other point as well is, part of it is also what the U.S. can do to increase its connection between the U.S. government as well as companies, right? To ensure that there's that recognition, that there's that connectivity. I also think there's some aspects of this that relates to the companies themselves, right? Often, you see some of these big companies, as you kind of pointed out in your response there, they market themselves as global companies. They don't necessarily market themselves as American companies. And there's such an international brand that people sometimes don't really realize the connection between the United States and these individual brands. And so that messaging component, I think, as you highlighted correctly, I think is really important. I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about on the security side, a couple of the flashpoints. One is the sort of Taiwan question, which I wanted to zoom in on because you've looked at this for a long time from various perspectives. We've seen U.S. officials now talk publicly more about how China has moved from what they characterize as preparations to really more of rehearsals for a Taiwan scenario. We're also seeing countries like the Philippines do more with Taiwan, some of which has come out in the public domain, others not so much. More governments are also quietly thinking through some of the scenarios for their own interests, right? Whether it's securing their own citizens, or if there is a military scenario, how are they going to respond, and what are the stakes there? What's your sense of the extent to which there's a sense of regional awareness, preparedness as well for these scenarios in Southeast Asia, and what more needs to be done, and what could be done better in terms of not just fostering the conversation, but also really preparing for these scenarios that might occur in the coming years?
I guess, to be blunt,